Hey everyone, Anarch here, and today's video is going to be a bit of a departure from the norm. I'm actually going to be doing a response video to ContraPoints. So I'm going to assume that the majority of my audience actually knows who ContraPoints is. Her name is Natalie Wynn, and she has been a philosophy YouTuber for quite some time now and makes a lot of commentary on politics. The reason I actually decided to do this video was because of a series of tweets that Natalie did on Twitter. And those tweets I will lay out here in a few minutes. But first, I just want to preface by saying that I do not dislike Natalie. I know a lot of people on the radical left really do not like ContraPoints. However, I disagree. I actually like Natalie a lot. I've been watching her channel for quite some time now, and I've always been a big fan of her work, even when I do have disagreements. So this is not a call-out video or a debunk of Natalie Wynn in a broader sense. It's actually just that the tweets that she made were, I think, an opportunity for us to talk about the concepts of voting, electoralism, and anti-electoralism. I should also mention that I was once a lot more pro-voting than I am now. In fact, there was a period of time where I was making a lot of the same arguments as Natalie is making in these tweets and in a few of the videos that we're going to look at. That means that I actually know these arguments really well, so I have no intention to strawman either Natalie or anyone else that thinks that voting and electoral politics are really important. However, I have strayed away from that position for a reason, and I intend to lay out in this video why I do not any longer hold that position. So I'm not going to make you wait any longer. Let's just read through those tweets that Natalie made. So on July 3rd, Natalie said, "It's really easy to caricature the anti-electoralist left as online misanthropes whose politics is firebomb a Walmart and then not firebombing a Walmart. It would help to dispel that myth if they were more vocal about what specifically their methods have achieved. We're all frustrated that the Democrats aren't stronger, more effective, further left, savvier about strategy. But the Democrats can at least point to some significant accomplishments in the last 4 years. A major climate bill, infrastructure investment, nominating Justice Jackson. What has the anti-electoralist left accomplished in the same time frame? I remember in 2020, a lot of mutual aid funds going around for protesters and people hit by the pandemic. That counts as an achievement. What else? Anything on the level of influence as a major climate bill? As someone terrified by the prospect of Trump returning to power, can you reassure me that there's a plausible direct action / non-electoralist means of stopping him that's more likely to succeed than electing Biden / Harris? Because if not, I think you're a LARPer." So it's pretty obvious why a lot of people responded negatively to this, right? Even if these arguments make a lot of sense, the language that Natalie is using here is kind of incendiary. It's certain to get people angry. However, before I respond to those tweets directly, what I'd like to do is lay out exactly what the anti-electoralist position actually is. I feel like up front, what I should mention is that anti-electoralism is not the same as abstaining from voting or advocating that other people abstain from voting. It's not that simple. Don't get me wrong, there have been a lot of historical radicals who definitely do advocate that we abstain from voting, and I am quite certain that Natalie has interacted with a lot of far leftists in the modern day who are saying much the same thing. But I just want to make clear that that is not the totality of the anti-electoralist position, nor is it even really an important part of the argument. I say all of this because that's not my position. I don't really care whether you vote one way or the other, and we're going to get into why, but I just want to put that out there before we continue, because I know that a lot of people who are watching this video, that's probably their main sticking point. It's so important in their minds that if I don't say that up front, you may not even watch the rest of the video to understand the position it is that I'm going to try to present here. So the anti-electoralist position generally is comprised of two key factors. The first is that voting is largely a distraction. It's something that makes us feel like we have a lot of power. It presents itself as being very important, but in the larger schema actually doesn't do very much. And there are a lot of technical reasons why that's the case, especially in a place like the United States. I could get into all of those fiddly technical distinctions about the Electoral College and first past the post systems and so on, but I just would like to lay this out in its totality. So let's continue on to point two. Point two is actually the more important of the two aspects in my mind, and that is a belief that all of our energy, all of the efforts that we spend into electoralism, into participating in people's electoral campaigns, into canvassing, into phone banking, into arguing with people about who should or should not be elected, these are an enormous waste of our energies. These are a distraction from much more important issues that we need to be engaged in. I once held this pro-electoralist position, so I know what you're saying in response now.
Why is it that when you tell people on the left to vote, they think you're saying quit your job, abandon your family, retreat from society, and fall into a deep slumber from which you emerge once every 4 years to vote for a shitty lib before fleeing into the forest and re-entering a ritual slumber on a stone slab in an eldritch temple awaiting the return of Beelzebub? Voting doesn't take that long. At most, it takes 1 day. You can vote and do other things also.
This is an argument I used to make a lot. I really thought that this was the key argument that sort of dismantled the anti-electoralist position. However, I definitely don't think that anymore. And the reason is because we actually have limited energies. And while it's true that if all people did was vote and maybe spent a little while, just a few hours or a day on voting, it wouldn't be a huge deal. It's not accurate to say that most people who are engaging their minds on the topic only spend that amount of energy on electoral politics. Quite the opposite, in fact. When elections come around, they tend to subsume all other kinds of discussions. Everything becomes about the election. Everything becomes a discussion about different people we could vote for, about the strengths and weaknesses of different candidates, and furthermore, shaming people for not voting, or really spending a lot of time even encouraging people to go out there and vote. That may seem like it's sort of anodyne and unimportant, but all of those things take mental energy. That is mental and physical energy that you could be spending on other things. And I've found that in a general sense, people spend less energy on bottom-up organizing in measure to the amount of energy that they are spending on elections. And that includes all those things that I mentioned a few moments ago, not just going and voting. That's the least of anybody's concerns here. It's all that time that you spend thinking about, discussing, worrying about the election. More than that, a lot of people then go further and canvass for different politicians and phone bank for them, as I said earlier, and those things are a much larger expenditure of energy. Whatever amount of energy you are devoting to that is energy you are not devoting to other things. In general, you'll find that people who hold this pro-electoralist position, they tend to not do much else. In fact, I think one of the biggest problems with this pro-electoralist position is it gives people the sensation that they've already done the most important thing that they can do, which is voting or supporting one of these candidates. I think it sort of reassures them that they don't need to do all of the other stuff. In general, people whose minds revolve around electoral politics, they're not going out and building organizations, they're just posting memes on Facebook or angry rants, or at most, maybe attending a protest.
I fully expect to vote for Biden and then protest the administration that I voted for.
But I'm advocating something a lot more than attending a protest.
We've been talking a lot about my plan, but what is your plan, Tabitha?
So, as she says, what is the plan? I mean, if you are anti-electoralist, then what do you think you're going to do instead of voting for president or a senator or a congressman or something? So this is a good question. What is the alternative if we're going to spend our time trying to discourage people from spending all their energies on electoralism? Do we have any sort of suggestion for an alternative? Well, I have to admit that this was a big part of why I wanted to make this video. One thing that I notice about the way that Natalie engages with this topic is that she seems to think that there are only two approaches. Number one is reformism, and that is to say, working within the system, trying to carry out incremental improvements to our laws and to the people that are sitting in seats of power, or a violent coup, some sort of armed overthrow. And the latter position is the one she tends to ascribe to people who are anti-electoralist. And I understand why. I think a lot of the people that are probably in her comments are those exact sorts of people. And in this video, you might have seen sort of some short clips of this caricature of an anarchist who she's calling Tabby.
So you sit here vote shaming me and in the next breath admitting it won't do anything? You're a counter-revolutionary lib with no plan except just vote. Tabby-chan, Tabby-chan. Look, I promise I'm not as dumb as I apparently look, comrade.
That seems to be the sort of people she is aiming this critique at. But what I'm hoping to do is present a third option. The third option is something called prefiguration, often referred to as a dual power strategy. And what I want to do here is lay out this dual power strategy. So the dual power strategy is about building alternative institutions in the here and now, outside of the prevailing power structures that exist. It's about creating the new in the shell of the old, as the IWW used to say. And I'll be a little more specific about what I mean. Prefiguration is about creating the sorts of entities we wish to see in the future world to the maximum degree possible within the world that we currently have. That includes things like cooperatives, time banks, mutual aid organizations, radical horizontal organizations, reading groups, free schools, and a variety of other sorts of things. The list is actually quite large, and if you want to know more about the sorts of things that I'm talking about here, you can go watch my video, Constructing the Revolution, which is built to be a sort of introduction to this topic of prefiguration or dual power building. And the thing is I think Natalie is sort of aware of this strategy, at least in the back of her mind, because here's her from the voting video talking about how capitalism prefigured itself in the 15 and 1600s.
Capitalism is an epical world economic order. When you say end capitalism, you're talking about a tectonic shift in global politics that is so much bigger than all of us that I don't really understand what course of action you're recommending. Like before capitalism, there was feudalism, and feudalism ended over hundreds of years of complex shifts in population and production, not because people just decided it was time to end feudalism. So won't capitalism end just whenever a new economic system overtakes it? I don't think that's the kind of thing that can be accomplished by a small group of activists. And I say small group because, I'm sorry to break it to you, but the vast majority of Americans are not communists.
I use this clip because I agree with Natalie that these tasks are enormous, that they are world historic, as was sometimes said by the historical left. The sorts of things that we need to do in order to build this movement that can actually transform capitalism are extremely painstaking and labor intensive. They're going to take an enormous amount of focus and devotion and learning about what kind of world it is that we want to see. And that's precisely why I'm an anti-electoralist, because the tasks at hand are not a part-time job. These are not something that you can just pick up and discard at a moment's notice. These are full-time devotions. These are things that you are going to have to find an enormous amount of grit and wherewithal for the rest of your life to see them come to fruition. If we actually want to change the system of capitalism, we are going to have to put everything we have into it. And we don't have anything to spare for all of this effort that we use talking about electoral politics, engaging with these people's campaigns, all of this effort, all of this mental stress that we invest into this system. It is all mental effort that we could be using elsewhere into these things that are indeed full-time tasks. Revolutionary constituencies do not just come about of their own volition. They come about by a small group of devoted radicals committing themselves to the transformation of society, to actually convincing large groups of people that they can indeed rebel against the system as it is, that they can indeed build an alternative, that they do indeed deserve a dignified life, not just begging for scraps from the table of their masters. That is not easy. It will not be carried out by anyone in an electoral position. And I hate to say it, but the people who are spending all of their time worrying about elections are not the people who are out there building this alternative system. They're not the people who are prefiguring the new system that will replace capitalism. And there's a good reason for that. That's because these two are sort of mutually exclusive approaches. We're talking about the difference between reformism and direct action. And this sort of brings us back to her tweets. She asks, what kind of achievements has the revolutionary left made in the time in between the election of Joe Biden and the current day? And the answer is very little. And the reason that answer is true is because revolutionary activity from the bottom up is not an on-off switch. It's something you have to build from a very small constituency to a very large constituency. It's a slow process of getting people these small gains that build into bigger and bigger gains. And it's very easy, if you're not engaged in it, to sit and criticize from the sidelines.
I feel like so much of internet politics, whether radical or centrist, is just posturing. It's showcasing that you're funnier and smarter than the normies, that you see through all the bullshit, the corrupt system, the electoral farce. But all you're doing about it is sitting here shitposting and demeaning the people who are actually trying to accomplish what little can be accomplished. And in effect, edgy leftists who complain about both sides and do nothing are no different from edgy centrists who complain about both sides and do nothing.
That's what you're engaged in, Natalie. People who are doing this work are spending so much time and effort and resisting burnout, even when things are so hard. It's very difficult work, and it can often be very discouraging. And I understand how, looking from the outside, it looks like nothing is being done, but things are being done. It's just not flashy. We don't have a multi-billion-dollar marketing campaign that's spreading news of everything that's taking place. And so I know it seems like nothing is happening, but that's because, as you said, prefiguration is a slow process. And And what we really need is more people to engage in it. We need more people to promote these small victories as they take place. And we need people like you, Natalie, to recognize that these gains are obviously not going to be on the scale of what the state has achieved in any given span of time, because the state holds all the power. It's like going to a feudal serf or some small merchant in the feudal era and asking them, what has your business achieved in the span of time since this lord or this king has reigned? There's no way that merchant could claim that anything they had done had added up to anything that one of these huge landed estates underneath a lord had achieved, or what some king at the head of a nation had achieved. And yet it was the activity of all of those people that were carrying out this new form of capitalism, that were building out things like the guilds to protect the peasants from the expansion of private property, that indeed gave us the conditions that later took over the entire world system. So what I'm trying to intimate to you now is that you're kind of like a lord apologist in the time of feudalism that is speaking down to the people who are engaged with the guilds, speaking down to the lowly merchant class who has not yet risen to world power. And I'm trying to get you to sympathize with these people who are in the process of making these sort of embryonic bodies that may one day develop into something much more powerful, and trying to get you to take seriously how hard this task is, how much effort it really takes to devote your mind and your spirit to doing these things, even when you're constantly surrounded by naysayers and distractions from people that all they care about is who gets elected next and what law gets passed. All the while, things are just constantly devolving into fascism. It feels like you're being gaslit by society. You're trying to build the alternative. You're trying to build the life raft that can actually help people survive this transition into an incredibly dangerous, violent, scary time. And you're constantly being told that instead you should be devoting your efforts to caring about who Joe Biden picks as the head of the FTC, or, what politician said what on national television last week. It's not that those things don't matter. It's that if we want to see this system actually altered, you should be trying to build power from the bottom up. But I also want to answer some of the questions in her tweets a little more directly. So let's get back to a couple of those tweets. It's really easy to caricature the anti-electoralist left as online misanthropes whose politics is firebomb a Walmart and then not firebombing a Walmart. It would help to dispel that myth if they were more vocal about what specifically their methods have achieved. We're all frustrated that the Democrats aren't stronger, more effective, further left, savvier about strategy. But the Democrats can at least point to some significant accomplishments in the last 4 years. A major climate bill, infrastructure investment, nominating Justice Jackson. So one thing I want to emphasize here is that even if what you're looking for is electoral gains, if what you're looking for is changes in legislation, you should understand that it is bottom-up pressure that creates these things. Joe Biden and all the rest of them wouldn't have instituted anything progressive in their policies if it had not been for a bottom-up movement that was pushing them to do so. And it should be understood that historically, almost all of the gains that we take for granted were actually achieved by a bottom-up movement, not by the politicians who carried them out. The politicians who carried them out were only doing that because there was such an overwhelming pressure from below that they hardly had an option otherwise. In fact, here in the United States and in a lot of other places in the early 1900s, that huge wave of social democratic gains that took place, those were achieved by the workers' movement. the progressive era of FDR and all the others didn't just come about because they thought, hey, I think it's about time we give some handouts to the workers. They came about because there was an enormous movement that they were afraid was going to carry out a revolution in the United States or elsewhere in other countries. And these movements didn't just come about wholesale because people said one day, hey, let's hold a protest. They had to be prefigured slowly from a gradual process that originated in the early to mid 1800s in a lot of places. And those processes, those organizations, those unions, those federations, they built up, they accumulated more and more power until they could just carry out a strike. They could just do an enormous protest that was actually a threat to the power structure. And they gained all kinds of things in that process. These movements were responsible for the minimum wage, healthcare expansions, workplace protections, the weekend. That's right, the very concept of the weekend, limits on work days, the end of child labor, unemployment benefits, and given that they also swept a bunch of social democrats into office across the planet, they also led to regulations on industry, sweeping infrastructure plans, and an enormous number of other things that we take completely for granted now. But here's the thing. Today, everybody wants instant gratification. They want to see the results right now. But you can't get results like the things that I just listed by going out and holding a protest out of nowhere. We can't just snap our fingers and have results. So it can be really frustrating when you're on the ground trying to construct the sort of constituency that could extract those sorts of results again, to be told that what you're doing doesn't matter, or that it hasn't achieved as much as the state achieved when it was pressured to do things. Obviously, we don't have the power of the state. If we did, we wouldn't be in this predicament. So that means if you want electoral outcomes, you should still be mostly focused on the creation and promotion of bottom-up movements. However, the opposite cannot be said. So if we focused all of our attention and efforts on electoral approaches, we would not, in fact, get a huge bottom-up movement as a result. And in fact, what we've seen over the last few decades is that the more effort that we put on elections, the more time and energy and attention that we've put into electoral outcomes, we've not seen that we got more progressive outcomes. We've seen that there's been a slow slide towards fascism, and that the Democrats, having no anchor from the bottom to stop them from the drift, have instead just become these sort of mealy-mouthed center-right wingers who just acquiesce to everything that this rising fascist ascendancy desires. So I know I've focused on Natalie here, but it's mostly because Natalie is expressing something that a lot of other people are feeling. I think she summarizes herself pretty well in this chunk from voting.
Psychiatrists have this distinction between two kinds of suicidal thinking. So there's intent, which is when you have a plan for how you're going to do it, and then they have to commit you because you're a danger to yourself. And then there's ideation, which is you're not actually going to do it, but you just have that inner monologue that's constantly saying, I just want to die. There's no more joy for me left in this world. I just can't stand it anymore. So right-wing extremist discourse is violent intent, whereas left-wing radical discourse often amounts to revolutionary ideation. It's a kind of fantasy escapism, an alternative to politics.
Personally, I would have to agree. I think there's a lot of leftists that really are stuck in ideation and not intent. They do a lot of posturing. They are sort of obsessed with the aesthetics of radicalism, not actual radicalism. And so when you're a person who really wants to see things get done, and you're sort of surrounded by these leftists who really only seem to care about the aesthetics of radicalism and are stuck in what you might call revolutionary ideation, then it's easy to kind of dismiss the seriousness of what's taking place. But I just want to emphasize that you probably wouldn't have made the same argument in the early 1900s. And that's because something happened in the interim. In between the strength of the early 1900s, which led to the progressive era and a lot of the social democratic gains that were found throughout Europe, we saw the destruction of the revolutionary left. I don't think I need to belabor the history here. Most people are aware that there were two Red Scares, one taking place in the very early 1900s and another one just around the time of World War II. And these were devastating to the revolutionary left in the United States. In the interim, we have not actually built up the revolutionary constituency that we lost. It's my opinion that from about the 60s to the early 2000s, we were largely engaged in revolutionary ideation and not intent in the United States. And this is something I've been facing myself, both as an organizer and as a theorist and as somebody who just observes history. And you'll see that in my work, I actually talk about this phenomena. In fact, I actually did a video called Aesthetics as Radicalism, kind of addressing this very thing. In fact, Murray Bookchin talks about this tendency. He calls it lifestyleism, this sort of focus on having a radical lifestyle, on the aesthetics of radicalism, but not actually doing anything that builds a revolutionary constituency in a larger sense. So I totally understand how you have this viewpoint that the revolutionary left is kind of fundamentally unserious. But what I would really like to emphasize to you is that that's not true. The revolutionary left is not unserious. There are just unserious people in the revolutionary left. And I'd just like to ask you to reconsider spreading this sort of rhetoric because it's harmful to the redevelopment of that revolutionary left. And just so you know, if you're watching this video, Natalie, I would love to have a conversation with you about this because I actually really enjoy your work. And I think you're a brilliant person who has the potential to help a lot with the very things that I'm describing here. But I just want to emphasize that the leftist revolutions of the past all began small. Everything that is big now began small. A tree comes from a seed. And these things, they have to be nurtured to fruition. You can't pour gasoline on the seed and then hope to see it grow into a tree. We need people to support and encourage these movements. It might look like LARPing, but it's really preparation. And not everybody is preparing properly, but we have to prepare if we're actually going to get anything done. So with all of this said, go out and vote. Who cares? I personally would never shame you for voting. Personally, I don't think it really matters either way. If you want to vote, vote. If you don't want to vote, don't. But what I would like to ask you to do is to spend less of your time and energy and efforts on electoral politics. Spend less of your time reading about candidates and poring over policy and concerning yourself with the outcome of elections that you really have almost no control over, especially if you're not in a swing state in the United States. Don't spend your time phone banking. Don't spend your time canvassing for a politician that doesn't care about you. Instead, spend your time prefiguring the world that you want to see, because we need you. The task ahead is not easy. We need revolutionary intent. So I think that's about everything I wanted to say on the topic. I hope if you were more pro-electoralist when you came into this video, that this was at least informative. And I also hope you watched all of it because I expect that a lot of people in the comments are just going to be trotting out arguments that I address in this very video. Delightful. But in any occasion, I appreciate you sticking around for the duration of this video. And I also want to suggest that you go follow Natalie's channel. Despite everything I've said here, she is still a wonderful creator, and I enjoy a great deal of her content. Also, if you enjoyed this video, you should go over and click subscribe down below. If you liked the video, click like. If you support the work that I'm doing on this channel, you should go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. There are tiers at $2, $5, $7, $10, $12, $20, whatever you can afford. That would be an enormous help for me. And I should also note that 5% of my Patreon every month is donated directly to a group which is carrying out the very sort of prefigurative praxis that I advocate, and that is Cooperation Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So just know that when you become a patron of my channel, you are donating directly to prefigurative revolutionary activity. In any occasion, I think that's all I wanted to say. I will see y'all next time.